Hello, and thank you so much for joining me on the same drugs. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Um, so I've never been to Australia before, and I'm starting to think that's maybe a good thing. No offense.
That's a comment. We're getting that a lot now. That maybe it's not such a great idea for a travel destination.
Can you tell me a little bit about the political climate in Australia? You have a liberal government in power, is that right?
Yeah, so like most of the Western world right now, we have a conservative government in power, which is a liberal government for Australians, but for everybody else, I call them conservative to avoid confusion. And the problem is, it's not a traditional conservative government. So the Liberals we have in power now are more like a left wing government. They're pretty much indistinguishable from the Labor government, except for a few, like they're not as extreme, but they definitely have a left wing policy. So you wouldn't associate them with Liberal Party 20 or 30 years ago. So yes, in name they are a conservative party. In practice, they are producing policies that you would consider of the left. Just like Boris Johnson in the UK is pretty much considered to be a left-wing conservative. Same sort of thing. So that's what we have in Australia.
So that's really interesting because, I mean, something similar has happened in Canada. And I sort of am getting the impression that Australia, Canada, New Zealand are pretty similar politically. But so we currently have a liberal government in power. And they're sort of like a center left party, I suppose. And in the last election, which happened in the fall, the conservative government, which is supposed to be a right wing government, but is closer to the Democrats than the Republicans, like they tried to really rebrand themselves as a liberal party. So as similar to the Liberal Party that was already in power, like the leader of the party, Aaron O'Toole, said, "We're not your dad's conservative party." And I found it really strange because I was like, well, there already is a liberal party. You'd think that, and then we have a leftist party too. We have the NDP, which is, a further left party. So I don't know why all the parties are sort of trying to be the same. And certainly I don't understand why a supposedly right-wing party would try to rebrand as a center or center-left party. Is that what's going on over there also?
Well, you know what they say about Canadians, you're basically Australians, but colder. So Australians and Canadians are so similar. We're far more similar than the UK or the Americans. We seem to be basically little colonies sprung out into the middle of this dangerous landscape, and it's made us pretty similar people. And it's
Yeah.
no surprise that we have similar problems with our politics. And what basically happened is the left were really great at marketing. And so they've managed to market these big apocalyptic policies like climate change and some of this Black Lives Matter stuff. And they've managed to promote that as virtuous and as vote winning. So what the conservative parties did is they saw social media and thought, oh, yeah, okay, well, we'll sort of cuddle up slightly to these political movements and pretend that we're going to be supporting them in the hope of winning votes off the left. Now, of course, that doesn't work in practice. You can't be a shadow of the left and expect to stay in power, because if you're going to be left, they're going to vote for someone who gives them more money, which will always be the Labor Party. And so what's happening is all conservative parties are trying to move to the left chasing votes, and they're losing their base. So their base is being left behind while they're chasing the left-wing votes. And that's why we all have these minor parties, conservative parties, popping up in clusters and taking over the conservative base that have been left behind. Now, that is how the Westminster system should work. That's what's supposed to happen. If a mainstream party wanders off their little bump in the road, then the minor parties will come up and they will be reformed into a new conservative movement. That's what's happening now in Australia. You'll see that the Conservative Alliance of parties, they're sort of joining into a soft agreement where they're going to preference each other. So they're not a coalition, but they're voting as a bloc. And that's the beginning of a new conservative movement in Australia. So we're a bit further ahead than you are in that respect. We've got a fully fledged rebellion starting in the conservative side of politics. And you'll probably see the same thing happen in Canada, because it's inevitable in our political system, which we share.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess like I feel that that attempt for conservative parties, I've never voted conservative before. I voted for our left-wing party for my entire adult life until this past election. And in the last election, I voted for the People's Party of Canada, which is, was practically a throwaway vote. It wasn't a party that was actually going to win, but it was the party that best represented my interest. It's probably closest to like a libertarian party. So it's either that or not vote a lot at all. Because then
I'm more libertarian, so I'm a libertarian who has conservative economics. So I would be more inclined to vote. And actually, what's not missed often is that the old Liberal Party of Australia was a libertarian style party with conservative economics. So we weren't a conservative party like the UK Conservative Party, and we certainly weren't a Republican Party. That's often not understood at all about Australian politics.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I mean, what I don't understand, in part, there's obviously a few things I don't understand, but the Conservative Party attempting to brand themselves as a liberal party because that's what they see is popular in the media, on social media. But I don't think that that's actually representative. Like, I don't think that what the mainstream media is feeding us in terms of political narratives and in terms of what they are pretending as though the majority of the population believes, and similarly to what we see on social media, I don't actually think that's representative of the majority. And we saw that play out when Trump won the election in the U.S. They sort of were acting as though it was impossible that Trump would win and that everybody hated Trump and Clinton was a shoo-in, and then that wasn't the case. So it seems a little bit out of touch to me for a conservative party to think that they'll do better if they rebrand as a center or center-left party, because obviously there are lots of people who want to actually vote for an actual right-wing party.
Well, for the name, I mean, don't forget, this is the old school liberal. So this is English liberty and liberalism, which is actually a conservative concept. It's the left kind of talk about liberal as being left wing, but originally liberal is meant to be small government and freedom, which is what was conservative politics in the UK, which Australia inherited when it was being constructed. So that's why we're a liberal party, and that's why it's a small government party, and that's why it was more libertarian than, say, the Republican Party. That's its history. It's no longer like that. It's doing things like socialist policies. It's going toward big state governments. I mean, it's locked us up. I still haven't seen my mum for 6 months, and I don't know when I'll see my dad again because he's in Victoria. And like, I haven't been able to leave the house to go beyond like my 5K to Coles. Like, this has been our life for 6 months. That's not the policy of a Liberal Party. And we've also got, don't forget, we've got states. So our Liberal government claims not to have much control over what's happening now because we're subject to state law. But ultimately, our biosecurity laws do give the federal government ultimate control, but they've chosen not to do that, not to interfere with the states. And so we've got some Australians like Victoria, they're actually under a Labor government, a left-wing government. So all the protests you're seeing down there are against a Labor government. Same with Queensland, same with Western Australia. New South Wales is conservative, but again, we've got left-wing conservatives in the New South Wales government. So it's very, I don't know, you talked about why they want to brand themselves as the left, and it is a marketing exercise. They believe that if they copy the left policies, they will get that social media drive and get the uptick of votes. We've also got a whole generation of kids who have been taught to be left. They've been brought up as left-wing children. And so they're watching this young vote suddenly hit. The first generation of young voters who are predominantly left is now coming up to the voting cycle in this next run around, and they're worried they're going to lose power because of all these left-wing kids. Now, that's their own fault for not paying any attention to the schooling industry for the last 30 years. I mean, they made the mistake of letting Labor run the schools, and so now they've got no natural deviation in thought in the younger generation. That's really sad. It's almost like a generation of ideologues. You should have left and right people in every generation, not just mono thought, which is what we've got coming up. And that's why they did it. It's not successful. People always follow strength. And so if you're a weak government, you've got weak ideas, and you're a poor copy of somebody else, you're going to lose power. You have to be your own government and be true to the principles that your party was founded on. And then you will hold government, and then people will come to your party. And that's what the minor party's approving now.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's similar to what's happening in schools in North America and Canada and the US, which is that they, high schools, elementary schools, as well as universities and colleges have become very monolithic in terms of their political ideologies that are taught and professed. They're all majority left-wing ideologues.
They won't pass you. They won't pass kids at all if they don't agree with the rhetoric. This is the problem. You can take one course, and if you don't complete all these forms of all this rubbish stuff that's got nothing to do with your course, then they will not allow you to progress to an education. So it's sort of mono-thought by force. You've got no choice.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about what's happening in Australia in terms of COVID. Are you in Sydney? Is that right?
Yeah.
Is it pretty much the same throughout Australia, or does it differ from state to state in terms of policy
It's
or
okay. So
restrictions?
it's similar in the fact that we're all being severely impacted by COVID health orders. So we've all got a similar problem where the states have imposed basically dictatorial rule over us where they can make any laws they want. And it's resulted in the mass loss of businesses. So small businesses have decreased by a huge percentage because they physically weren't allowed to trade, but the big businesses were. And so they've all had that sort of problem. Everyone's been locked up at one stage or another. There's travel restrictions that come on and come off again. So everyone's been impacted across Australia, but each state has been more or less tyrannical than the other one. So Tasmania's been the least tyrannical. Because they're a little island on their own, they're sort of disconnected from the rest of the politics going on the mainland. But Sydney, for example, tried to play it open for a while, and then public social media pressure and pressure from the states led to us being just severely locked down. And so we ended up with, I think it's been 6 months since the unvaccinated have been allowed to have any kind of a life. And we were promised that on the 1st of December that there'd be no more restrictions on the unvaccinated. So you could work, you could go back to moving around. And so all these people held on. And then our Premier, Dominic Perrottet, came out and said, oh, well, just kidding, it's going to be the 15th of December and 95% vaccination rate. And so then all these kids lost their jobs because obviously employers were like, well, we're not going to hold you for another 15 days. And so everyone loses their jobs. So, and they're also enabling this idea where you can be discriminated against. So instead of saying discrimination will be over after a certain date, they're like, oh, well, businesses can choose to continue discriminating against people after that date, which is really, it's leaving a whole stack of people without work, without a future. Even if they're allowed to travel after that date, they still can't earn a living. And they're also going to start importing thousands of immigrants in to take our jobs off us because there's a job shortage now because they've sacked all the unvaccinated people. So there's a bit of fury building about that. But in Victoria, which is what most of the news has been talking about, they had the worst lockdowns in the world. And their government's run by Daniel Andrews, who is Labor Party. He's got close connection to the unions. And what happened is he tried to install dictatorial rule over the people of Victoria, which is the ability to claim a pandemic whenever he wants, even if there isn't one, and to make any law or any COVID health order that he wants, including detention without explanation, shutting businesses down, not allowing people to travel, imprisoning people, fines of just huge fines that you could never pay in your entire life. And that's the bill that people have taken to the streets. 500,000 people were there last weekend trying to stop this bill from going through for basically installing him as a dictator. So he's the worst example. But, I mean, Daniel McGowan in Western Australia is pretty bad. He's basically locked Western Australia down. It's its own state. You can't go to Western Australia. You can't even get there if you're a resident. That's it. It's closed. They've become like a little island. And the Northern Territory, I only saw this a couple of days ago. Michael Gunner's crazy. He's like totally off the planet. I didn't realize how bad he was until I saw his press conference. Like, wow, I think the Northern Territory might actually be the worst place in Australia right now.
That's crazy. So what's this bill that they're trying to pass in
Victoria? So
Victoria,
It's
thanks.
a southern state, right? It's at the bottom, not quite Tasmania, but the bottom of Australia, underneath New South Wales. And it's the pandemic management bill, and it's basically an amendment to an existing bill. So it's about pandemic laws, and it's an emergency health order. So it can ignore every other law that Australia has, and this one supersedes it, except for a few human rights pieces of legislation. It's basically a supreme law, and it allows the Premier to declare a pandemic whenever he wants without having to meet any criteria, just if he feels it's necessary. There doesn't have to be a live virus in Victoria for him to do it. There doesn't have to be any cases in Victoria for him to do it. So he can just say, yep, there's a pandemic, and that allows him to create health orders that he feels are necessary, including discrimination. So he can discriminate against groups of people if he wishes to, including political affiliation. He can lock people, detain people wherever they are for basically indefinite periods of time. He can introduce licenses for general activities. So he can stop, for example, an unvaccinated person from being allowed to run certain businesses. He can shut businesses. He can stop travel. Just the laws that he can do are crazy. And the 60 of the big barristers in Victoria wrote an open letter to the minister saying, you can't do this. This is a dictatorship that you're declaring. And so that's why you've got 500,000 people on the street being like, they're marching up to Parliament, and they're hosting big rallies on the steps of Parliament House, with a lot of the minor party speakers are leading them, and a lot of ordinary people trying to stop this bill from going through. And he had the numbers last week, and then it's no point explaining to Canadians so they won't understand, but basically in an act of political revenge, one of his own government came forward and said he was going to vote down the bill because of a personal matter that happened to him. And he lost the numbers. And so now we're all sitting here waiting to see if he'll bring it back, if he's going to table the bill or not. Because if he does, he'll lose and it's gone. So it's the biggest political story in Australia right now. We're trying to stop a dictatorship from happening.
This is so crazy what's going on. And I mean, exactly, it's like these ongoing emergencies that politicians or the party in power is continuing to declare. I mean, they've done this in Canada as well. Just allows them to ignore constitutional rights, ignore the law, and to operate however they like.
Privacy laws, they don't matter. No more privacy.
Yeah, it's really, and to me, it's really scary. And I left Canada as a result of the restrictions and forthcoming crackdown on constitutional rights and free speech and freedom of movement and all of that stuff. But one of the most confusing things to me about this whole situation is that in Canada, at least, most of the population appears to be on board. They re-elected the Liberal government, and Justin Trudeau used things like vaccine mandates and the COVID response and these restrictions as a means to gain political popularity, which is so strange to me because his response and the mandates would lead me never to vote for that party ever again. I wonder, in Australia, is there a lot of support for the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates?
Yeah, so it's happening in Canada too, because it's actually a common narrative for all politics throughout history. So if you can frighten people into something, you'll become popular. It's a great short-term way of gaining power. So yeah, while ever people remain terrified of COVID, if you can sell the terrified narrative well enough, then draconian measures like vaccine passports and discrimination against unvaccinated people, that's popular, but it doesn't last. So it will be popular for maybe 1 or 2 election cycles, but it wears off. This is the thing I was talking about. People follow strength. So if they think they're going to be saved because of this stuff, doesn't matter how crazy it is or how much of it violates your normal rules, people will still vote for it in large enough numbers that they will gain a majority. But the problem with all of this stuff, like every socialist country in the world, once people realize that, one, they're not being kept safe because it just doesn't work, and two, they'd really like to be free again because you get sick of being under dictatorial rule. It all starts to collapse and fall down. So yes, you're right. People will vote for it and it'll look popular, but it's a temporary thing and it does wear off. And it's because, sorry to say, people are stupid. If you don't recognize that this sort of behavior is irresponsible from a government, like a good government would never sell fear. You never encourage people to be terrified. That's not how responsible governance works. And you never try and strip people's rights away from them to keep them safe. You give them options. You say, well, we're going to provide you with this if you would like it. We'll provide these health services. We'll booster our hospitals. Like, this is how a responsive government acts. Unfortunately, it's hard. That costs money. It takes a bit of intellectual effort to do it, and they won't do it. They'd just rather say, all scary, we'll lock you all down, please vote for us. And so, yes, I think Trudeau's going to have the exact same problem that our political parties are facing now. Look at the rebellion on Australia's streets. Like, everyone thought that we were just complying and that nothing was going to happen. Remember, the whole world was looking at Australia going, why aren't they on the streets? We weren't on the streets because for 2 years we've lost all of our savings, we've lost our businesses. The fines that we were threatened with were crazy. They set up in every state detective squads of policemen to go through social media photographs and hunt down anybody who was videoed at a rally and fine them or imprison them, depending on how serious it was. So people were too scared to be on the streets. It wasn't that they agreed. They weren't silent because they didn't think, but they were terrified they were going to lose their jobs and their homes. And we've been a politically quiet nation our whole lives. We've never had to fight for freedom. Like Canada, we've been pretty calm. And now that they've stopped arresting people for protesting, the first weekend that we were allowed to protest in Sydney, there were 200,000 people on the street. And it was a bad day. It was bad weather, and we all rocked up there. So there's probably going to be twice that here this weekend. And I'll be there. I'll be at that rally this weekend. I wasn't allowed to go last weekend, but I'll be there this weekend. So perception and reality can be different. Just because people are frightened to go out and protest doesn't mean that they agree with the policy, and that's what we're seeing now. All the quiet people feel safe enough from their government, not from the COVID, from the government, to go out and say, actually, no, we do not support what you're doing. We're not going to continue discriminating. And the tide, you can feel very strongly in Australia that the tide of public opinion has turned. As soon as it got hot, people didn't want to wear their masks. So it's hot in Australia. Like, we're not going to wear masks in 40-degree heat. It's not going to happen. We're sick of not seeing our family. It's turning. I don't know about Canada, but we've definitely turned a corner down here. Are you actually in Canada now, or did you flee and leave?
No, I moved to Mexico.
You moved to Mexico. I love it. So people are now moving down the border to Mexico to escape the.
And like, it's so interesting. So I left Canada in January because I couldn't handle the lockdown anymore, and they were it was in December or something that I bought a one-way plane ticket, and it was because they were talking about not letting people leave, and I was like, I'm getting the fuck out of here before I get trapped.
We can't leave. I can't even leave my city. I can't even go in my state, which is, forget interstate travel or international travel. I can't even go and see my mum a few hundred kilometers away.
So how are they policing that? Like, how are they policing your movement from city to city or state to state? Obviously, it's easy to police the borders, but within Australia, what are they doing to ensure people don't move?
Australia is it's so hard to explain to people who haven't been here. We don't have lots of major roads. So because of our mountain, they're not mountain ranges, okay? They're not like Canadian mountain ranges, but they're like ranges, right? They're covered in scrappy bush and everything. Because we've got basically a town and then a connecting road and then another town and then a connecting road. We don't have like a massive scattering of roads and cities like you'll see in America, for instance, or in the UK. We have a single sort of thoroughfare that goes through and a few other big thoroughfares that go off, and then they spot little towns along the way. It's sort of almost along the old explorer routes that we went through. We haven't really progressed much beyond that. And so it's easy enough to block one road. It's like a breathalyzer test. They have cops there who just randomly pull you over to test if you're meant to be traveling or not. And so, yeah, you might get away with it 5 or 6 times. But if you get caught, the punishments are so severe. Like, I mean, I live week to week with my rent. So if I was to get a fine that they have in this COVID stuff, to me, that's sort of a disaster for my ability to continue to have my house, right? And so the risk is so high that most people aren't doing it because we've lost all of our businesses, we've lost our employment. We can't afford the fines that they're in. So it's almost threat. It's basically just the threat of being caught is enough to stop people from traveling. And it's wrong and it's not great, but at the same time, what can you do if you don't have enough of a backing to get yourself out of these fines? It's crazy.
And how much of the population is vaccinated at this point?
So we're heading up towards, in New South Wales, we're about 92%. But what's really interesting is before they brought in, so the narrative in New South Wales was, we'll offer everyone the vaccine. Once everyone's been offered, restrictions are over. You can do what you want, right? And under that narrative, only about 35% of people got vaccinated. Maybe 40 at the last week, but it was about 35 to 40% people were like, yep, okay, and got vaccinated. So that wasn't working for them. So then they said, if you don't get vaccinated, we're going to lock down Sydney and other places in New South Wales. You won't be able to work, you won't be able to travel unless you get vaccinated. And so under that, basically, and there's no public money. So basically people were put out of work and everything was shut down until you got vaccinated. So under that regime of vaccinate or starve, pretty much, they've got it to 92%. But that's not really what we'd call a free choice. That was definitely coercion. And when you talk to people, most people were vaccinated because they had to keep their jobs or their kids wouldn't be able to continue going to school and they'd lose their homes. And so the reason that our protesting is so strong is because people were forced into a decision rather than it being voluntary. So you often see the press quote, oh, well, they're just a minority because 92% are vaccinated, going, yeah, but not willingly. And that's why you're seeing these huge protests on the street, because it wasn't a choice. It's not a free choice. So yeah, you've got to be careful of that in the press. They're selling it in an extremely dishonest way.
And so if you are vaccinated, are you allowed to travel? Are you allowed to operate more freely than if you have not been vaccinated?
So I'm not vaccinated, so I have to live like a second-class citizen. So we've got these things called vaccine passports. And so at the front of all of our shops now, they've got the big vaccine passport check-ins where you can only go into shops if you're vaccinated. So I'm allowed, it's easier to say what you're not allowed to do than what you are allowed to do. So I can shop at our 2 local big supermarket chains, which are Coles and Woolworths. I can go in there, I can mingle, I can browse for food, I can stay there with everybody for as long as I want and shop. I can go to the big shopping centres, like the Westfields, and I can walk up and down the aisles. I can go in the food court, all that sort of stuff, but I can't go into any of the shops in the shopping malls because they've got vaccine passports. So the rule, and I can't, like they had stores like big Kmarts and Bunnings and stuff and JB Hi-Fi, which were considered to be essential services during the lockdown. So everyone could go into them, vaccinated or unvaccinated, they're essential. But now they've decided that, no, only vaccinated come in there. So we've now got a situation where if you're unvaccinated, you can basically shop for food. That's it. You can't do anything else. Nothing, no other services at all. But still, if you're double vaccinated, you still can't travel interstate easily. A lot of the states are closed down. So, for example, WA can't get to. Queensland's got a quarantine situation. Victoria's got a quarantine situation. So you're still getting quarantined. You're still having to sit around and pay all these massive fees. You can't just cross boundaries like you used to do. So it's not like you're fully free. And there's still restrictions too. You can't have like anybody you want at your place. You've got to have this many people and then make sure you have all these rules. And you still got mask mandates. So it's not like vaccinate and then have fun. It's still restricted quite severely.
And can you leave the country if you're vaccinated?
You have to apply for permission to leave the country. So if you're a really important businessman that the government likes, or if you're a politician, then yeah, you can leave the country. But they're only approving a small, like a few thousand people to leave. And you know, the country 25 million, a couple of thousand people being allowed in and out is not really freedom to travel, if you know what I mean. And that's why everyone's so furious that the government's bringing in tens of thousands of foreign workers to fill our jobs when we can't even leave to go somewhere else to get a job. Like, so people are basically being trapped in poverty in their own country and can't even get away to go somewhere else.
That's crazy. You know, like even in Canada, like you can leave the country. You can, like, if you're vaccinated, if you have this vaccine passport, which is totally creepy because the vaccine passport is digital and it's a government app. So you basically have to submit all your information to the government and then they can track. But you know, if you're not vaccinated, essentially you're trapped there. You can't leave, and you can't come back. But I'm totally amazed that they're trapping people in Australia and not letting them leave. Do they offer any justification for this? Because supposedly, the reason there was this push to vaccinate everybody, supposedly the reason for these vaccine mandates are so that they can get case numbers down and so everybody can go back to normal. Except, that's not what's happening. Are tons and tons of people are dying of COVID in Australia? Why are they continuing to maintain these restrictions?
No, tons and tons of people are not dying in Australia because The US had a big problem with death rates, partly because they were paying hospitals to report them as COVID if they died, but also because they had if you go through the figures, unfortunately, if you are extremely overweight, you have a much higher chance of dying, and that's a problem in the US. And a lot of their figures are from that. And Australia, like Canada, we don't have that sort of secondary problem to that extent. And so and we're also warm. Like, you know, Canada, you can understand a little bit more that people might be a bit more frightened, but Australia's hot. Like, you know, our climate's warm. And we know that in warm equatorial climates that COVID is not anywhere near as successful at killing people. So our death rate, it's still sitting, for people who are under basically 45, you're still way more likely to die of the ordinary flu than of COVID. Like, way more likely. And yet people seem to think that if they get COVID, they're all going to drop dead immediately because that's what the government messaging is. But to give you an idea about this vaccine passport, we keep being told by our premiers, like one premier said, it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated, despite the fact that almost all the cases coming out now are from fully vaccinated people. And they say things like, you're doing it for the community, not for yourself. So even when it became obvious that fully vaccinated people are just as likely to transmit COVID as unvaccinated people, they didn't amend their rhetoric. They didn't change their story. They keep saying that it's about stopping the spread. You have to be vaccinated to protect other people. And the reason you're not allowed to work is because an unvaccinated person might bring COVID into the office. You're going, well, in court, that doesn't make any sense. And so when these cases have been taken to trial, so we've had several high court cases about these vaccine mandates in New South Wales in particular. And the answer that shocked me that the judges would give is that, yes, we agree that these orders are against certain other legislation. We agree that they don't work. We agree that they're wrong, but the government has the right to make these measures. And it's like, there's no justification, or it doesn't matter if they work or not, they're allowed to do them. And so there's no recourse for citizens to go, hey, but this is wrong. You can't do it. They're allowed to do what they want. But I didn't answer your question very well, but just to show you the problem with New South Wales is, we have a health minister who stood up and said, if you're waiting for Novavax, forget it, because we're not going to let Novavax into the state until we've got rid of our Pfizer stocks. So it doesn't matter that people want to use a safer vaccine and get vaccinated with Novavax, which they prefer over mRNA vaccines. Our health minister is restricting access to other vaccines because he's done a deal with Pfizer to distribute all the Pfizer stocks. And that is unethical. It's got nothing to do with health. He's meant to be a health minister. He's removing choice. So it's not even will you get vaccinated or not. You're not even allowed to choose what to get vaccinated with. And that is, what is their excuse for that?
Well, yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, this is mostly financial because they've focused so heavily on not just the vaccine, but like you say, certain vaccines, and totally rejected any other form of treatment that's cheaper, or, you know, that I guess they haven't made a deal with the company that's producing that treatment.
We can't name, or you'll get demonetized and kicked off the entire platform.
Yeah, exactly. We can't even say the words. Like, it goes so deep.
2021.
I'm curious to know at what point, like when the lockdowns first started, I was in favor. Not very long before I realized that the lockdown wasn't actually just going to be like 2 weeks to stop the spread. It was just going to keep going on forever, and that they were feeding us contradictory information that didn't make any sense.
$1 billion. That's what it should have been.
Yeah, exactly. But did you, like, were you sort of right away skeptical, or did it take you a little bit to figure out that this was not or that this was a dangerous response?
I was skeptical pretty quickly, because it was already obvious that, like I said, they should have closed the borders with China straight away. As soon as you get weird stuff happening over there, you should close the borders, because clearly something's gone wrong. And that's the most, and just with China, like the rest of the world doesn't have to close their borders, just go, right, contain that country that's having a problem. That's usually what you do. But they'd already started to reveal that that dodgy footage coming out of China, people dropping to the ground, was fictional. It wasn't real. They were setting it up. And so when you can already see that they are ramping up propaganda, you probably got something more happening than just an organic virus. It's not like Ebola when it was happening in Africa, where you could sort of watch that spread and knew what was going on. This was a little bit different. We are already seeing straight away that cases weren't as deadly as we were being told right from the beginning. And we also knew that the way we were holding people was causing them to be more deadly. So we had cruise ships, first of all, in Australia. That's how our stuff started, because we didn't have hard borders. We had people coming on by cruise ships. Now, the most dangerous thing you can do to anybody with infectious disease is hold them in a ship with a stack full of other people who are sick, and keep them in close quarters, because it increases the viral load and basically you've got less chance of recovering. Doesn't matter what the disease is, people get much sicker on cruise ships than they do anywhere else. And even then, it still wasn't killing a whole cruise ships full of people like we were being led to believe. And so we started with quarantining of ships and stuff like that. So by the time Australia had to think about that question that you asked, it was already through Europe. Like, it was already in Europe, it was already in America, and we'd already had some data coming in to show us that no, it was more like just a bad flu. And so when we locked down, we were like, why are we locking down when clearly it's already running across the world and you can't stop it? It's clear it's going to become another endemic virus. Because human race gets new viruses every 20 or 30 years, like proper ones. And every couple of centuries, you get another, like a big one, like an influenza that comes through. And you can't stop them. Doesn't matter what you do. Lockdowns don't work. And so penalizing the economy is not a helpful reaction to a new respiratory disease that isn't that deadly. And so, yeah, a lot of people were like me, were like, why would we shut down when it's clearly not going to solve our problem? It's not so much that it's not a good idea. It's not a solution to the problem that we're being given. If it was an Ebola solution, you can quarantine it for a shutdown. But respiratory viruses don't work with lockdowns. So it's not a viable solution to the problem that was being offered us. It just delayed the problem indefinitely. And you've got to do it eventually. Like now, Australia's doing what everybody else did, but we're just doing it a year later, but we've still got to do the exact same thing as everybody else.
So I just read that they're doing these quarantine camps. And what I read specifically was that health authorities in South Australia were organizing quarantine camps for Aboriginal people, which I thought sounded pretty ominous.
Usually, I think it's the Northern Territory, unless South Australia is doing it as well.
Maybe South Australia is doing it also. I just read something today. Hold on, let me see if I can find it.
The leading news story is the Northern Territory problem, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if South Australia was doing it as well, because Queensland is also doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, so this was just published yesterday. So it says, this was on abc.net, and it says, health authorities in South Australia are racing to organize quarantine camps for Aboriginal people unable to quarantine at home.
So they're copying the Northern Territory. So what we've had happen is the Northern Territory went first. So they've been taking people from very remote Aboriginal communities, and the army has been escorting them to compulsory quarantine in Howard Springs. And don't forget that Northern Territory actually hits South Australia in the middle. So even though there's sort of a lot of stuff, Northern Territory and South Australia weirdly share a lot of policies because of the way their regional Aboriginal communities intersect in the middle there in Australia. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if they've taken a leaf out of Michael Gunner's book, who's the Chief Minister of Northern Territory, and decided to start escorting Aboriginal people into quarantine camps. Now, that is a breaking news story at the moment in Australia. So I work for Rebel News, and so we're all trying to confirm what's going on in these regional communities. It's extremely difficult because no one's allowed into the Northern Territory to start with. And so you can't even get into the state, let alone go and work out what's going on in these regional communities. And then they're also locked off as well. So you can't interview anybody. You can't get in there and talk to anybody to find out what's happening. You can't get any video footage of what's happening. So all you can do is really approach ministers and ask the ministers what are happening. But again, what are the ministers going to say? Yeah, we're doing the wrong thing. It's just difficult for us to get a clear story right now about what's going on. But we do know for a fact that Aboriginal people are being taken by the army to quarantine camps because of what they call overcrowding issues. So we know that's true. We just don't we can't talk to anybody or find out how they feel about it happening to them.
Like, I just can barely believe that they're doing this and pretending as though it's not a super
Wrong?
sketchy thing reminiscent of the residential schools when they took Indigenous people in Canada out of their homes and put them in schools, took them away from their families and so on and so forth. And I know it's not the exact same thing, but it certainly does sound very similar. And you'd think that if anybody had paid any attention to history at all, they might think, I don't think that taking Aboriginal people out of their homes and putting them into quarantine camps and not allowing media access so that people can find out what's really going on in these camps. That it just doesn't sound quite right.
Especially the people themselves, they're not like city dwellers. They don't have iPhones attached to them, so they can't put their own stories out themselves. So they don't have any way of talking to the outside world without help, which is what's disturbing me is there's a whole stack of people who would be considered good people ordinarily, who support these kind of measures for the greater good. And this idea of the greater good and collective health is the exact same mentality that was used to create all the other mistakes that we made in history. It's a paternalistic way of looking at people. And what I find extremely disturbing, I have no idea if it's made the news yet, but the documentation and that's been going out for vaccination to these communities who are remote, they're cut off. They don't see the world story. They don't know what we see online or anything like that. Their first experience is when someone rocks up at their house and talks to them. They're being told that basically this is pretty much the Black Death and that you're going to die unless you take this vaccine. So they're not being told what their relative risk is or anything like that. They're just being told, you have to have this or you're going to pretty much die. Now, that's not informed consent either. And the Western Australian government came out, the police commissioner was saying just this morning that they're going to go door to door with these regional communities. And if they don't say yes to the vaccine, well, then they're going to sit down and talk to them. If they still don't say yes, well, they're going to come back the next day and talk to them, and they're going to persist with their campaign. They're going, well, that's harassment. That's trying to badger people into choices. And the Western Australian government also said they're going to create internal borders around these regional communities if they refuse to get vaccinated, so that they won't be able to leave and no one will be able to come into their communities. I mean, this stuff is crazy. It's such a mild virus in reality. If you have if you step back and look at it, the statistics, you're going, it's not the Black Death. It's not a global disaster. It's the least deadly pandemic, as what the World Health Organization called it. Going, yeah, that's correct. We've got 7.5 billion people, so you're going to get a lot of deaths from 7.5 billion, but statistically, it's not.
And why is it that they're targeting Aboriginal communities specifically for these quarantine camps?
Because they say, so the Northern Territory and probably South Australia too, and Western Australia, but particularly the Northern Territory, they never did anything with their hospitals. So currently their hospitals are overflowing with mental health patients, because they've all been traumatized by the COVID epidemic and not being able to do anything. So they're all presenting to mental health hospitals. And so they've got no beds. They know they can't look after anybody because they didn't put any infrastructure in at all for COVID. And so to cover up the fact that they didn't do anything that they're supposed to do as a state to look after people's health, they're removing people from their Indigenous communities, they're remote. It's hard to explain to people how remote these communities are, but there's not even roads or tracks in most of these places. You've got to fly in and fly out. So they're taking people away, I suspect, so they can make sure they don't die, because they know they can't actually help them in their normal situation because they didn't do the work. The state governments just didn't do the work required. And so now your rights have to be pretty much knocked over to cover up government failure.
And are the Aboriginal people who they're bringing or intending or planning to bring to the quarantine camps, like, will that be voluntary or forced?
Compulsory. So this is what we're trying to confirm now. We know that close contact and case quarantine is compulsory. It's not a choice. Even in cities, they have been taking citizens out of cities and putting them into quarantine facilities. If they don't want to go, they've been dragged out and taken into quarantine. So they're not just doing it to Aboriginal people. They've been doing it for quite a few months now to everybody. And you can't say no to a forced quarantine activity. So we can't get anyone to say it because we can't interview anybody, but we know that it's not voluntary, that you have to quarantine like this if you are told to.
Well, this is all very creepy. And I'm sorry that you're stuck in Australia.
Come to Australia, cheap flights, you love it. You just never leave. That's all. That's the only problem.
Do you think there's any end in sight, or do you suspect this will kind of continue indefinitely?
We're solving it politically. So that's why I talked about politics in the beginning, because we're taking the true English libertary, oh my God, I can't speak today. We're taking the true English liberty track here. We're going through politics. We are punishing our politicians for what they're doing by basically electing minor parties. The largest political party in Australia right now is a brand new minor party, outranking any of the major parties. So we are going to pretty much vote all of these assholes out of power and see what it feels like to be in a minority. And that's how, also we're stopping, the minor parties are currently stopping bills going through various levels of our government. So they can't do anything. We're basically saying, hey, go and do something about these mandates, or we're not passing any of your stuff at all. So it is working. The tide is turning, and all the minor parties needed was a bit of confidence that people were out there, that they supported them, and we've seen that now. We've seen Australians hit the street en masse. So yeah, I think there is hope. We're going to solve it politically. We're not going to go full French. We're not going to host a revolution like that. We want a restoration, which is what I wrote in the Spectator. It's about restoring Australia, not tearing it apart, but putting back what we had. We're not going to build back better or any of that garbage. We're going to return to an actual state of normality. We want our old lives back. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your optimism, because sometimes that's hard to come by these days. And I'm really glad to hear that there's a lot of people pushing back in Australia. It sounds like the protests are growing. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Doubling every weekend.
Yeah. Okay, that's excellent. Thanks so much for talking with me about this. I wish you all the best in your endeavors. I'm supporting you. Can you tell us how we can find you and find your work online?
Sure. I am Ellie Melly on Twitter, which is ELLYMELLY. If you search for Ellie Melly or Alexandra Marshall, you'll find me. I post most of my stuff from a Twitter account, but I've also got a blog, which is elliemelly.blog. I write for The Spectator, for Good Stores, for Rebel News, and for Penthouse Australia, of all things. And I encourage
I'm sure
you
people
all.
are reading it for the articles.
Oh, every single time. You know what I tell people when I'm buying it? I just say to them, I'm in it. And that just usually shuts them right up.
Good trick.
So I encourage people to be optimistic, because if you're optimistic, and people will follow you. So try to be hopeful that we have a future together and that we will one day be free again. And my best of love and luck to Canadians as well, because, you know, you're like our siblings in another part of the world. We love you.
For sure. Okay, well, thank you. That's hopeful. I appreciate it. And yeah, good to talk to you again. I'll be following, and have a great evening, day. What time is it over there?
It's afternoon, just gone afternoon. Very civilized time.
Well, have a good rest of your day. Take care.